Hello and welcome to another Madaxeman Army List podcast for Art de la Guerre. This time I'm of course again joined by Richard and Dave, and this week we're looking at a pair of lists, or possibly even more than a pair of lists. You'll find out later what I mean by that as we look at lists number 99 and 98 as we dive into the classic great face-off of British history. No, I don't mean Blur versus Oasis. We're actually talking the Ancient Britons and that other list that follows it, that is the Scots, the Caledonians, the Picts, and all sorts of other people from north of the border in two of the more unloved but very well-known armies in Art de la Guerre. Sit back and enjoy the podcast.
This means war. This means war.
Well, welcome to yet another eclectic list podcast from I've got regular guests here. Dave, hello, how are you doing?
Hello.
From North London?
Good.
Fantastic. And Richard from even further north, although still London-esque, which is good. And we're all ready to delve into some of our trot through some of the famous but maybe not so popular, which is probably a euphemism for not so good, lists in the Art de la Guerre book. And this time we've given ourselves another, I think last time we had a match pair, the French and the English from the 100 Years' War. This time we've got sort of, well, I'm not even sure it's a pair, it might be four different things really. But what we've chosen to do for you this week is to look at a couple of the lists in the Great Britain section, which is basically 98 and 99. As we do sit here in Britain, the stuff about Boudicca or Boudica and all that kind of stuff, and the bits with the Picts north of the border repelling the Romans. It is a classic bit of ancient British or British history, but these lists are not necessarily among the most popular ones in the book. They're sometimes a bit one-dimensional, and sometimes it's kind of everybody's got one, but you kind of drift into using them as Gauls and getting the heavy infantry and make it a bit better or something like that. So we thought we'd look at these two lists, 98 and 99, and see what we could pick out of them. But I think there's even a question, is this really two lists or is this actually four, from the way they put together? I don't know, what do you guys think? Because that list 99, the Caledonians, Irish, Scots and Pictish, has three different sections, and no common troops at all, which is unusual.
Yeah, I think there's a good argument for splitting it into three separate lists. And I think the Caledonians are really there to represent the early period. And they aren't really very different from the ancient British. They're another British tribe that were based in what is modern day Scotland. But after the Romans had defeated the Brigantes in sort of roughly Yorkshire and Cumbria, they moved on up and had a couple of battles with the Caledonians, which were, while they could win battles, they couldn't win the war. Whereas the Irish, Scots and Pictish are perhaps fit better with the Romano-British and the Saxons. They're really armies representing the so-called barbarian conspiracy in about 370 AD, and then on into the 5th and 6th centuries.
Yeah, it is odd, isn't it? That Caledonian list, you're absolutely right. Looking down it, that could easily be part of the ancient British list, couldn't it? Add in the Atticotti, take out some of the levy, things like that, and give an option for mountains as an extra terrain type, and you've pretty much got it there, haven't you?
Yes.
In some ways. And those were the two which actually fought the Romans proper up until, I think it says 84 AD. And I guess what happened then? Hadrian's Wall, and nobody ever went over it again?
Well, 84 is the subjugation, I think, of the Brigantes, and then you have the Battle of Mons Graupius, which is the Romans against the Caledonians. Hadrian's Wall, the Stangate, which is the Roman road that's several miles south of Hadrian's Wall, was built about that period and links the east and west coast and was used by Romans for supply. When Hadrian comes in, he decides that the empire needs to stop expanding, and I think that's around about 120 that work on the wall begins. You then have a period a bit later under when the Antonine wall is built, you know, a bit further north. But it's essentially the tribes north of the walls are, you know, certainly under Roman influence, but remain pretty similar militarily, but aren't actually ruled by the Romans. Whereas all the tribes south of the wall are part of the Roman province,
under the Roman yoke, and these are all armies, or these early two are very much armies that the chariot was either a sort of psychological or a real weapon of war against the Romans. Certainly that Mons Grampius battle has got chariot elements to it, and there's other, you know, different more kind of charity thing. What's your guys' views on chariots? Because in other sets of rules they've been, you know, hampered cavalry. I guess in ADLG they're a little bit closer to being cavalry than perhaps in previous sets of rules in terms of how they function. You know, maybe that is a function of how the terrain rules work and make it easier to get terrain off the table, so that you do get ground over which, you know, they're not massively disadvantaged through going into rough ground. But, you know, are light chariots of this type something that you guys have used or had a go at? Or
I think these northern chariots are obviously quite distinct from the sort of Egyptian ones with the archer. You know, here you've got a warrior with a javelin. A lot of debate how much fighting was done from the chariot versus the warriors leaping off and fighting, how much you might have light infantry supporting them. You know, I think we've just got basically Caesar's description from his invasion in 55, 54 BC and Tacitus. They're the main descriptions of the chariots, and they mainly talk about them charging backwards and forwards from left to right and making a lot of noise, but not having necessarily a great military impact.
I think they upset the Romans more than anything because they'd never really met them before as such. So, you know, Julius Caesar says they were a surprise troop they'd never sort of seen. But as Richard says, I think it's more guys rushing up on chariots, jumping off, throwing javelins, exposing their genitals and jumping back on and running away.
So it's kind of an ancient British Hanomag in some ways. They will kind of jump out and it's a debate as to whether they would have ever fired from undercover and done that then. Well, you know, I think it's an area or an era of history that is kind of well known, but I think it is one where the lists are less looked at than the history. So maybe that's kind of the best thing to do is to dive straight into the list. Now, we've got a number of ancient British lists and a couple of lists from the Caledonian, Irish, Scots and Pictish list or multi-list to have a look at. But what we're going to do now is just have a quick flick in order, in sort of sequential order at some of the ancient British lists.
This means war.
Here's the first one. This was a list that I used a few years ago, actually, and I think it was actually driven by the fact that I've just collected a lot of chariots in my time. You know, that's the Phil Barker legendary ancient British Panzer division that used to be, might even have been a pre-DBM thing. Was it a 5th or 6th edition thing when ancient British chariots were superb under one particular set of rules? And buying chariots, there's a number of different companies who make them, and I ended up going through a phase of sort of buying 4 of each, and then suddenly finding out that I owned quite a lot of them as a result of that. And so this was just really in a 1-day 3-game competition in sort of a tight classical theme. And I thought, well, why not give this a go? Because if it's rubbish, I've only wasted a day of my life, and it's very rare to get all what, 16 or so chariots onto table. So this was taking the Javelin option, in which you change all of the warriors to light chariot. You end up with no pedestrians at all, and it works surprisingly well, particularly in a classical period. And I think what I found out or realized from putting it on the table 2 or 3 times was that an awful lot of those classical era armies have kind of a couple of very common things. They have a very ploddy infantry center that needs to engage the enemy and win a war of attrition, and they actually only ever have 3-4 cavalry or 3 cavalry and a couple of light horse on a wing and stuff like that, and that's not very many. And when they're all in period and they're all matched up against each other, that's fine. Your 3 companions overrun your 2 Roman horse, and there's a bit of spear supporting or something like that, and that's kind of what happens. But you drop a list like this into them that can sit there with first command coming out with an ordinary general, 2 light horse with javelin, 2 light infantry with javelin. That's doing nothing. That doesn't tell anybody anything. It just pops around and doesn't give anything away when you're deploying it. And then what you're dishing out next is actually 10 chariots, of which a good number are elite. You've got 4 of the normal light chariots can be upgraded, and then 4 of the warriors can be upgraded, so you get 8 in total. And an elite light chariot is an elite medium cavalry, which really elite medium cavalry is pretty much as good as, or nearly as good as, ordinary heavy cavalry. But if you look at it in that way and said, here's a command with 6 ordinary heavy cavalry in it and 7 other things, 4 of which you can almost downgrade them 1 each time, and say 4 light chariots is better than 4 light horse by quite some way. The shooting, well, there isn't shooting, but so that's sort of irrelevant. But what I found was that this army with this second command of 6 elite, 4 ordinary, and 3 more light horse, that's overwhelming someone's flank. And even the piece about evading, you've got so many troops and so many groups here that you can actually risk evading with a few and getting caught, that because it's not catastrophic, and somebody pushing all their cavalry forwards, catching you, they suddenly find themselves in the middle of 10 chariots. Maybe they caught a couple of them, and then the rest of them just kind of mug them and take them down. And then that final command of 6 light chariots, 3 light horse is again, that is better than most people's cavalry wing, never mind the other bit. So I found out that particularly with the strategist giving loads of extra command, he's moving that around in 3 groups, maybe even 4. You're using 5 or 6 commands in some ways with this, all of which most people's heavy foot have got no target. Not a lot of people have archery. Very, very few have archery in that sort of classical period. And getting a fairly open terrain just gives you an awful lot of stuff that can evade, can come back. You evade with 3, you leave 2, somebody charges forward, you're in their flank, and you chew them up. And actually, not only was it very, very effective, it was almost one of those things that you could sort of feel a bit guilty about, because it was sort of almost impossible to play against, because there wasn't anything to get to grips with, or even to imagine that you could get to grips with. I think a couple of my opponents were a little bit disheartened, because there is the option of the ancient British and using it with something similar to this, but sticking with those 8 impetuous swordsmen. At least when they're on table, you imagine that you can get hold of them. But this option, suddenly it's like people realizing that their infantry center was going to be doing nothing at all. So, and again, casting this army in a slightly different light, there are very effective ways of using the early Achaemenid Persians. Is it the early or the later Achaemenid Persians, which is almost all medium cavalry, and it wins by overwhelming people and having width and bullying their light troops. And in some ways, this is actually almost the same, other than the cavalry are on square bases and have got wheels. So I actually found this a very, very effective army, especially in period.
I'd say it is. I mean, it's a very, very different army than anyone will ever normally face. I mean, start off with saying it's very, very accurate to the army of Caledonians. So, you know, this was when a Roman army was facing a lot of chariots and nothing but chariots. So we're talking about this. It's got fairly high initiative. I think it's 3, isn't it?
Yeah, there's all the light horse in there.
You know, you're going to get a good look at where your enemy is. I mean, if you put down the ordinary general with the 2 light horse and 2 javelin, you're going to get an extremely good look at where your enemy is. I presume you're going to take a road and a tiny weeny little field. You know? Exactly.
And the other thing I found was, you know, your opponent isn't expecting anyone to take this option. So in a 3-game competition in a single day, by game 3, people had heard about it and were aware of it. But the first 2 games, you've got your opponent is trying to clear the terrain off the table as well, because they're expecting, you know, 16 impetuous medium foot, and they want to engage them in the open and ride them down. Whereas you drop this on table and suddenly it's a little bit awkward. They've participated in your plan. You've kind of wrong-footed them before you start.
Yeah, I mean, but the other thing, I think you need the initiative. You need to win the initiative because you need to get across the table quickly, because you are going to be evading. I mean, one of the problems with ADLG when we first began was we were like, bloody hell, your light horse get charged and they run back off the table. So you're going to have to be very, very clever in the way you maneuver your troops to make sure that they have exits, that they don't run off the table, as I say. But I think you can go forward, pin things. You know, if that strategist goes forward and pins a group of, say, if the enemy's 6, you're going to get 4 chariots running around the flank. I presume that's the trick is to get round behind the enemy here. You could use this tiny weenie command to entertain a block of infantry. Just keep them plodding across the table doing nothing while you try and overwhelm. As you say, I mean, 6 medium cavalry on one wing and then another, you know, effectively 10 on another. It's just ordinary, isn't it? The one thing you don't see, the strategist in the middle of the table evading and ending up running straight back off his own back edge.
No, very definitely. So, you know, and I think some of it is about playing the trick and catching people out. And I think if people do know about it, it becomes slightly different. They do start putting different terrain down. But again, you know, even if you're playing a 2-list version competition, the odd one, you know, there are obviously very other different ways of doing it. Richard, what, you know, if you're thinking about driving a Roman or a classical army against this, what are you thinking when this drops down in front of you?
Well, first, just a quick comment. I think it's one of those attested times where we've got a barbarian as a strategist, and it's because Caledonians faced Julius Caesar in 55 and saw the warband getting butchered. So when Caesar comes back this time, he sends the infantry away and just keeps the chariots. So, you know, that is the mark of an outstanding general, to completely change your army from one campaign season to the next. I mean, I think what you have to, I mean, obviously it depends what you've got, but your basic plan is going to be a mixture, I think, of trying to keep pushing the enemy off the table, and to the degree to which you've got it, using your own mounted not to actually attack the enemy, but to try and get behind some part of it so that your heavy infantry can actually contact. Because that contact, if they ever manage it, the heavy infantry ought to butcher the medium cavalry fairly quickly. So it's just a question of can you, and so I guess, you know, one thought would be, if you're facing ancient British, is to go for forest or mountain so that there's more difficult terrain on the table. because neither the medium infantry nor the chariots will particularly like forests and steep hills.
Yeah, no, I suppose so. But I think when you're fighting ancient British, you do have that thing of I want to clear the table so that my
Absolutely.
heavy infantry and my charging cavalry can do them over. So no, but it's a really interesting army to take, and playing it was a real thought experiment, and it was really an odd experience for the people I was playing as well. So I think starting with kind of the most left field, the Phil Barker's Ancient British Panzer Division, and being delighted to discover that it actually worked.
No, I think it is an outstanding choice. Yeah,
I'd say one thing is not for the beginners. I think it's a very difficult army to use and to master, that one. But in
up to a point, but I think there is, there's an extent to which it's a kind of 1 or 2 trick army, and once you've worked out those 1 or 2 tricks, it becomes a bit more straightforward. But it's a very, very tricky one to beat.
This means war.
Well, look, here's our second one, and this is 61 AD. Dave, I believe this is one of yours, and you've gone with a Roman ally as well, because I guess the Romans got involved in quite a lot of these tribal squabbles on one side or the other. 26 units, ordinary, brilliant, ordinary. I guess there's no strategist if the Romans are fighting for you as well, fighting with you. So talk us through it, how you put it together and how you see it working.
Well, I mean, it's first of all, it's quite a large army, 26. It's got, I mean, with this ancient British army, it's very demanding. Everybody goes, oh, put that Roman ally in there to give you some stiffening up. That's the main thing. First commands 3 chariots elite and a horseman. I think that goes down first. The standard sort of micro command, stick it in the middle of the table, get a look at the enemy. And hopefully it can maneuver on itself to get to where it wants to be at some point. Then you've got the brilliant generals there to control and hold on to the swordsmen in the center of the army, and hopefully be able to maneuver the light horse. I think what you're going to have the brilliant general sitting with the warriors at the center of the table, trying to control them, because they're going to be give themselves an obvious target. Then what I want to try and do is use the Roman ally in combination with the micro command of chariots. So what I want to try and bring to bear here is the light chariot elite, and then get the heavy cavalry combined with them to stiffen them up.
Okay, so you're using that on one flank there, right? So the Romans are driving down the middle then, I guess. And
yeah, I'm expecting the Romans to come straight down the middle of the table, trying to get into my medium swordsmen, and I'm going to use my pips, my command points, to combine up my light horse, my chariots, and my heavy cavalry to try and do some damage with that, and try and hold with the legionaries and the warriors, I think.
Okay, so which one are you sticking in the center of your 3 commands here then, if the light chariots are combining with the Romans?
I'd stick down the chariots in the center of the table first of all.
Okay. Wow.
I think they're going to maneuver first, and I'm going to do what we do with the Byzantines and try and, if I get the pips, if I get a nice strong dice roll of those in ordinary general, I think they're going to turn and shoot off to go somewhere where they're better suited to be, is my hope. And then I can use the brilliant general to maneuver into the center of the table if it's possible, to become the medium swordsmen in particular are not bad. You've got 4 elite guys. If they win their combat, they still got a double hit on the first go. I played Simon Leray Mayo, and we were using Romans against ancient British, and his medium swordsman actually ended up beating my legionaries. So there's a possibility they can do some good.
Yeah, once they get elite, they do become quite pokey, don't they? It's there's that thing of, I'm not going to throw them at heavy infantry, but actually they're as good in first round combat as as the heavy infantry versions, aren't they? As long as they don't take any
As long as they don't
shooting on the way in, and you've got 3 light infantry javelin to screen them, which is pretty decent.
I mean, there's a lot of light horse there, so want to try and, you know, if it's possible, I'm going to sort of use the general to hold the warriors in one place, while he uses his Picts to manoeuvre those light horse out to combine with the light chariots. You've got 3 light chariots and 4 light horse, and then the light horse can maybe get round the back or something, or the light chariots elites are going to combine up with the heavy cavalry from the Roman ally to try and give you a bit more stiffening up there. Yeah, and then you've got one auxiliary in there which is useful in some terrain at some point.
And I guess the other good thing is you're using 84, you're the Roman ally, you're using early Imperial, so this is like proper square shield, you know, textbook Romans as well. It's a good chance to get some of those on table. Richard, what are you thinking looking at this one?
I think what's nice about it is it's a fairly chunky size, so you're going to have quite a lot of width across the table. The Romans allow you to, you know, to support either to stiffen the chariots or to extend the line of the impetuous swordsman. You know, both of which are quite nice features. Perhaps unlike Dave, I would be more tempted, I think, to put the light chariots on a wing, but as he says, there's nothing to stop. It's so small, you could quite handily deploy that in the center and immediately move it off to the outside of the Romans, and that can be quite disconcerting for an opponent when you do that, because they've already made their plan and now you've just spoiled it for them.
Yeah. Yeah, there's
you know, it's so I think with all these sort of armies, it is about trying to get your opponent off balance, because what these armies with the medium swordsman impetuous or the light chariots, they're very good if they can be the one doing the strike. They're not so good if they get pressed into a long war of attrition, because they don't have the armor and they've only got 3 cohesion. So it's all about jab, 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 rather than just standing toe to toe and slugging it out.
Yeah, no, I think that's it, and it is easy to underestimate. You know, it's just that feeling that those 8 medium swordsmen are squishy, but actually they're okay. And there's 8 of them. There's 3 legions and auxiliary. That's up to 12. 2 heavy cavalry, 14. You know, 3 chariots there, 15, 16, 17. You get them in the right place. You've got a frontage of 17 that is actually perfectly capable of standing up, particularly as those light chariots are elite. You know, my theory being that's nearly heavy cavalry. Or sometimes arguably better than heavy cavalry. I guess my army previously obviously had a 45 camp. I do wonder if this is one of those armies that benefits with it, but this one, I think you're quite front foot. But if your chariots are moving out the middle, whether you've actually got the maneuverability and squeezing in a 45 camp might be better. But
good point.
What would you drop out?
I think a fortified camp is a very valid idea. I mean, but as you say, I mean, you've got two ways of fighting this army, going with a 12 wide infantry, you know, which is all impetuous or impact, or trying to combine up 3 elite medium cavalry, in essence, 3 chariots and the 2 heavy cavalry to become a decent cavalry force of 5, which, as you say, is unusual. And you've also got 4 light horse in there, so you can play it in 2 different ways, depending on, you know, the way what you're up against.
And actually, whenever I've looked at it, I guess because I own a lot of medium infantry swordsmen, I've always tried to kind of either do a lot of that or a lot of chariots. But using the Romans, I've sort of skipped over, but that does give it a decent infantry center, and I guess you could drop some of them from elite or drop the armor and have 4 of them, and that's actually a decent center as well, isn't it? With those other warriors. So all sorts of different ways of doing it. Very interesting.
This means war. This means war.
So look, Dave, that was your list with the Roman ally. Now, Richard, you've also pulled together an ancient British list. I think looking at this first glance, firstly, bloody hell, it's enormous. But secondly, well done to us for getting the 3 different ways of putting this list together that are all quite different. But you've somehow managed to get initiative 4 and 31 units, which is spectacular. You sure there's not another spreadsheet error in this one, like there was in the 100 Years' War one? No,
I don't believe so, because
don't believe so. It's enormous. It's great. Yeah,
you get 2 points for the strategist and 2 points for 6 light horse.
No, that's great. That's good. No, I meant more the 31 though. That's an enormous amount. But so you got a 9, an 8, and a 14.
2 of them are mediocre levy.
True. But look, tell us how your 9, 8, and 14 gets put together and how you use it.
So this is based on Boudicca's rebellion in 61 AD. I think probably a lot of people know the history behind that. If not, please go look it up. So a brief originally was you're going to be fighting other sort of British or Roman armies. And I thought, well, how does a Roman army hurt this kind of army? And it's by shoving a good heavy infantry command up the middle and crushing all before it. So my thought was I will deploy a skirmishing command in the middle. So I've gone for 6 light cavalry javelin and 2 light chariots. The idea being that the light cavalry javelin pull back in front of the enemy, whether that's cavalry or infantry. But if they pursue too far, then the light chariots would be able to strike them on the flank as they come forward. So because that prevents the light horse having to eventually get pushed off the table. So that's behind that second command. Then I went for the foot. So the first command essentially has an included general, 6 wide, medium impetuous swordsman, 3 skirmishers to screen it, with the idea that might actually flank march. If depending on what the terrain was like, or that I would hope to be able to deploy it and drift it out towards a wing, or maybe start it in a plantation so that it would go up one wing while Corps 2 kind of entertains a big chunk of the enemy. Corps 3 then is a similar kind of thing, but here the idea would be to run the 2 light horse and the 2 light chariots very quickly right down the edge of one table and then turn them to threaten while the warriors come on frontally to stop your opponent responding to that flank threat. And, then you're up to the dice gods.
Yeah, well, I guess it's one of those things that we keep thinking about. There is that focus on the heavy infantry and the cavalry strike force, but rough terrain, 6 medium impetuous swordsmen in rough terrain is kind of going to be better than most things it's going to meet in rough terrain, isn't it? It's just that magic number, and with a couple of light infantry to give them even extra width and extra overlaps, that's quite handy to do it as well. I don't know, Dave, what's your thoughts on this one? Would you enjoy using this?
I think it'd be really good fun. I think it'd be crazy fun. I think the idea of 8 light horse javelin is really, I've gone strong on the light horse javelin because I think they're actually quite a potent part of this army, especially in combination with the chariots. I think that's an interesting scenario. I think they can zip off together. I think, if you put 6 light horse down one flank, okay, they're going to have trouble against some heavy troops, but some of them are going to get behind the enemy. That's the one thing you want to do there. I think the other thing that's interesting is having the strategist in Boudica is you're going to have 3 ambushes, and I think ambushes are going to come in quite handy with this army. If you've got a plain with some plantations, you can hide even a few medium infantry and things like that in it, especially when you've got a 31 31 base army. You know, if you threaten an enemy with a flank march and 3 ambushes, yet again, you know, something might just be springing out of an ambush, which is a surprise here.
Yeah, that's the thing with this army. What terrain, Richard, do you see? Because you've got still light horse who need to get around, but they don't need that big a gap to get to squirt through. What is there a sort of terrain strategy that goes with this?
I think, given the large number, I think I might actually be tempted to defend, and then go for you know, maybe a couple of plantations, a plantation on a hill, and a couple of fields. Because I've still got, with the strategist, I can still move one piece, but actually it's more to upset my opponent. I don't really care. Again, with 31, I think I wouldn't be too tentative. I think you've got to pile on the psychological pressure on your opponent, because it is about keeping them off balance, because ultimately, as I say, if you get drawn into too much of a stand-up fight, he'll probably wear you down. So you've got to force him into making mistakes.
That's true. Actually, I've played not against an ancient British army, but one of those sort of, is it Bajor or something like that? One of those Araby armies that has enormous numbers of troops, and impetuous swordsmen. I think came with the camels, but one of the commands in that I really remember was 6 light horse as well, which looks a bit powder puff, but until you see them on table, you realise they're going to outnumber you and be in your flank. And what was very effective was very effective was putting down a river. And you know, if you put down a river, psychologically that's normally brilliant. We both narrowed the table down by, you know, whatever, nearly a foot. But the 6 light horse started the other side of the river and just ran alongside it and turned. And you're suddenly going, oh, I've got an on-table flank march of 6 wide that I've got to do something about. And if I just leave them, they'll be in the back of my army. And because you psychologically put that river in a, yeah, that's all gone kind of box. And you've tested for it the minute you put it down. So you know how difficult or easy it is. And it was just a very easy command to do an on-table flank march with as well.
I think a river's a really good idea. Really good idea.
I think that's right. And I think, as you said earlier, in this sub-period, there isn't a lot of shooting. And actually 6 light horse javelin can be, you know, because you can still have them doubled up on a frontage of 3. And they're throwing, you know, if you're facing pikemen or something like that, they're suddenly throwing some quite nasty firepower into the opponent. And their sheer breadth makes it quite hard to get round. It's much harder to get round 6 than it is to get round 2 or 3.
Absolutely, yeah. No, again, I think looking at the list, I do like the fortified camp with this one.
Yeah,
and
you could easily drop a light horse javelin. Yeah,
there's a couple of light horse that you could play about with, and possibly, and then that would maybe get you your 2 elite warriors into command 3 as well. And then you'd only be 30. Terrible. How grim would that be? But no, it's a really interesting thing. And that point about throwing a lot of terrain down just to mess up the enemy, and then you actually don't really care about it, is quite an interesting way of looking at it as well.
This means war.
Okay, well, look, that's covered the ancient British in 3 very different ways of using it, and now we flick on to number 99, the 3 list 1 list army. And Dave, which one of the armies is this one that you've got up here on screen?
This is actually Pictish.
This is Pictish, right? Okay.
This is Pictish in the 3. One of the things you were saying earlier, I think our Scottish listeners might be upset when you try to make the Caledonians part of the ancient British.
Yeah, true.
We might be defying it Brexit there, but so this is ancient Pictish. it's got the Saxon ally. That's what's made it really interesting. I guess this is slightly out of period because we're going to have to be a lot later. I put it in as 450 AD. I think that's about roughly around the right time.
When just jumping out of that for a question, then the Pictish army, if that was a separate list, what date line would that be?
Well, it goes from way before BC up to,
right,
you know, quite a way.
So the Pictish continues throughout this whole timeline. Then it's not these aren't sort of sequential. The Caledonians, the Scots, and the Picts.
Well, I'd say the Picts are around. I mean, historically, not in terms of the rules, but they're around until the Vikings appear in Scotland.
But they would have started contemporaneous with the Romans and the ancient Brits.
In Roman times, you've got essentially the Caledonians in the south of what is today Scotland and the Picts in the north.
Yeah.
And then in the 5th century, the Scots, which are actually an Irish tribe, emigrate from Ireland to modern day Scotland. And then through the Saxons have taken over what is today Lothian. That's part of the North Anglian kingdom. And you then have a series of wars which culminate in about the 9th century with a Scots-dominated kingdom beginning to form over modern Scotland.
Okay, so the actual question then is about the Scots or Irish, whether that list would actually go, well, it might go back as far as the Romans, but no one ever went to Ireland, and that's where they were at that sort of point in time then. But they came into Scotland in the 5th century. Right. Okay. Bit of potted history, but no, Dave. Sorry. Back to this one.
Okay. So, I think, yeah, the army's stiffened up with the Saxon ally having the impetuous heavy swordsmen. So I think they've got to naturally go down the centre of the table as a proper war band, and their job is just to steam forward and try and do as much damage. And then I'm going to use command 1, which again I've used as a tiny little command. Because you've only got command of 2 here, you need to have the brilliant general to get something in control and manoeuvring. So I think a micro command makes sense. And I think that the job of that 2 light chariot elites and 2 light horses just to dick around on one flank and try and slow the enemy. Or, as we said in previous ones, is to zip around on its own and come steaming into where it can be most useful. Or make itself a flank march. You know, you've got a 27 sized army. It's easy to have a flank march of 4 of that army. I think a flank march, if it's optional in this place, is a good idea, actually. Then you've got the brilliant general commanding his impetuous swordsmen and spearmen. The interesting one with this is 8 medium spearmen. Medium spearmen are a little bit of a tragedy in this set of rules, I'd say, especially if they end up in the open. And when you've got to have 8 of them, I think giving them the missile support is a non-negotiable decision. You've got to give them something to make them slightly better. And the missile support makes them slightly better. So I think they're going to go down, and then the general's going to try and maneuver and use his medium swordsman impetuous elite as a fighting force. So you want to try and get them combined up with the Saxons, or maybe the general just maneuvers them on their own round a flank. Light horse is useful to break them down, and you've got enough light foot in there to protect your medium infantry from shooting and things like that, I'm hoping.
Yeah, there's a few. Did you get the feel when you were doing this that, something we've always talked about, digging into this list, you actually thought, actually, there is something here, or was this one kind of, look, I've got to pick a list here. This feels a bit like damage limitation. Did you sit here thinking, yeah, I'd like to try and make this work? I
think it'd be, as some of these armies we're doing in this podcast, it's more of a challenge to yourself, to how you're going to play this army. And you can, it's not the sort of army you go down the club and play every week until you learn it. So it's something you might be taken to a competition to learn on the job as such. And the interesting one with this is, can you learn to use those medium spearmen missile support? Do they work? That's the challenge. That would be the fun with this list, is what the hell are they? 8 medium spearmen missile support. That's an interesting troop type, a hell of a lot of them. And how are they going to work? Because in theory, they've got a lot of maneuver, actually. So you may, I think it might be a competition where you start going, well, that didn't work. Let's try this time. You may even
because I'm sort of looking at it and thinking, from what you're describing, shoving the Saxons down the middle, that does put your light chariots dicky about on the other flank. But you are at 27, and then your central commander's got 12 combat troops in it there. Whether I'd be almost tempted to take 3 of those Pictish warriors out of that central command, which still leaves you with 9, which is enormous to run down a flank and do so on, and just throw them in that first command, because it then creates, it's maybe not necessarily the best bulwark or anchor or whatever, but even if they die, you've got something that you can throw at the enemy that they have to beat or have to do something about, that just takes a little bit longer to allow your Saxons to get in and allow your 11 strong, we're overwhelming you on a medium terrain flank, forced to do it a bit better. Because I think it almost feels like 12 is too many, and throwing 3 as a bit of a speed bump on the other flank might just make that swing round on one flank approach work even better.
I think I tend to agree with that. I mean, when I'm looking at the list, I'm thinking 8 medium spearmen altogether is a bit of a weird one. I think it's almost tempting to just use them like you use javelin men. Or no, obviously they obviously don't shoot, but use them just for their maneuver speed.
Yeah.
In combination with the cavalry. If you can get 4 of them running down a flank on their own as fast as they possibly can, they could possibly do a lot of damage.
Yeah, someone's got to deal with them, haven't they? Richard, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the other thing to remember in this period, if you're facing a lot of troops like Romans that a lot of the time don't have impact mounted, that actually a medium spearman in the open with missile support is actually quite a tough prospect for an ordinary heavy cavalry, particularly if the line is longer than yours and you're worried about your flank. So I think your idea of taking 3 off, because it was going to be one of my comments that your main strike really is the Saxons, and I would be a bit worried that only having 2 light chariots to cover their flank is not really enough. But if you took the 3 Pictish warriors off and put it with that, and I think I would actually reverse where the general is. I'd include the Saxon general, because you really want that one to break through, and possibly not include, particularly if you've put the Picts with it, not include then the general with the smaller British command. And given the fact that all of your terrain types are difficult, I might be tempted to try and take more light foot.
Very true.
Yeah, because there's 8 of them, isn't there? That you're allowed.
You're allowed, actually.
I think you've got 8, possibly. You've got 4 javelin and 4 bow. So, and then obviously the ones in the Saxon allies. So yeah, you could squeeze in 4 light infantry javelin, possibly as well. Yeah. That might boost it. But yeah, you are still working around that 8 spearmen minimum, and then you do want the 4 Atticotti as well. So that's it. Once you've got the Saxons, you do start to run out of troops quite quickly, I suspect, which is it. But no, it's an interesting thing, and I think again, Richard, it's a good point about in period where there aren't too many impact mounted. Those medium spearmen do seem to be a bit good. I remember playing a competition in Spain against another. What was I using? I think I was using one of my Arab armies with must have been Umayyads or something, because they had Tibet allies, but a huge horde of medium spearmen just lurched out of some terrain at me, and my 4 or 5 Arab cavalry were kind of like going, this appears to be a lot harder than it should be, really, because they were about 10 wide, and it was like, oh, my factors aren't as good as I hoped. What's going on here? I've got to beat them, and I'm just going to get sucked into this. So yeah, I think in numbers there's a scale issue in which that does definitely start to work.
This means war.
So So finally, then, in our fifth list of the day, it's this one's a Scots one. This mysterious, the Scots, the Irish, the people in the middle, and again, I think this sort of fitted in the can I give myself a challenge to get something out of this, because partly I thought I wasn't keen on medium spearmen, and then the Caledonian one is very similar to the ancient British, really, but this was just trying to dredge the bottom of left field, but also thinking about it in terms of an in-period competition, or a very tightly themed in-period sort of British Isles barbarian-y sort of competition. And the core theory here is that little quirk in the rules, in that impetuous swordsmen don't count as impact against medium swordsmen, or against swordsmen who stand to receive. And so what I've conjured up here is a 29 unit army that it's got an 11, 11 and a 7, so they're all decent. 2 competent generals and an ordinary one, and this is about absorbing a charge from 6 impetuous warriors in most of these things, with a load of medium swordsmen, a wider group of medium swordsmen who are either the 4 Atticotti, which is in the first command. So that first command's got 4 Atticotti and 4 Scots medium swordsmen ordinary. So it does sit there as 8 wide and say, right, come on and charge me. And I'm guessing you've got 6 or so. And the Atticotti are going to be as good or better than you. And we're actually at evens in the first round. So I will win some and I'll lose some. But we're kind of trading off points. If that comes up against a Roman army, that's still an 8 wide competent rough terrain force, some of which are impetuous, some of which are not, and easier to maneuver to take advantage of any gaps. The second one does very much the same sort of thing. That probably goes on the other flank or in another big piece of terrain. And 8 Scots warriors, medium swordsmen, they're using maneuver and their ability to be controlled, and they're crossing their fingers on the roll of a dice in a first round combat against impetuous troops who don't get the benefit of their impetuous, their impact +1, because we will be standing to charge. And it's going, you lose 30%, you win 30%, you draw 30%, but I should have some overlaps here. So and then we just start trading off 1 for 1. Obviously Furious Charge still kicks in, but then that's tricky. And then the last bit is just getting something a bit more sort of solid-ish, but actually not that big, to throw into some open space. So you've got 2 of the Saxons, the heavy swordsman impetuous. The levy, I'm not fussed about that. But what I was possibly doing here was I've snuck in 5 fortifications, because that's one of the things that this army gets. And thinking, actually, these guys, maybe the Saxons, maybe the monks, maybe the medium swordsmen, you could stick some of this command behind probably 3 fortifications, or maybe 5, and then suddenly you're trying to funnel the enemy away from fortifications, because people are always worried about them and don't want to attack them, and get them to push into where hopefully you've defending in terrain, you managed to put down a load of terrain, and your 2 big 8 wide rough terrain troops are sat in terrain saying, come on in, we're wider than you. And people are sort of shying away from a kind of almost, it's either going to take a long time or it's a waste of time even taking it on. A couple of swordsmen, medium swordsmen, so they can go out and do something if somebody tries to ignore it. A light chariot in there just to chase around as well, with a general in it. So it's pretty odd. There isn't, it does rely on the opposition playing your tactic as well, but it is that bit about trying to catch someone a little bit off balance with a scratch of the head moment in a theme that's going to have, ancient Brits or Picts or the early Romans, a really tightly sort of themed thing, where being 8 wide and being good at rough terrain hopefully neutralizes the other disadvantages of just being medium swordsmen, which are a somewhat, even a more unloved troop type probably than medium spear. I suspect, because medium spear do get some advantages, and this is the only advantage of medium swordsman. It cancels impetuous impact, and this is a period where there is impetuous impact. So go big with them, because this is their moment to do clever stuff, or to shine, to use their one magic ability. Puzzled looks.
I think it's a proper shield wall, isn't it? When you talk, you've got 20, all right, they're medium infantry on the whole, medium swordsmen on the whole, but you've got a proper shield wall 20 wide, which is going to be a hell of a lot wider than most enemies. You're going to be on the defensive probably, which means your defenses are quite good, and you've got a lot of light foot for that terrain, as Richard mentioned. You're going to be if you're defending in mountains or forests, you've got the light foot to control those flanks, whilst your shield wall does the job.
Yeah, there's the full 8 actually, and it's two slingers and 6 javelin men. So there is a reason. Well, that's a lot of light foot, and yeah, if there is any difficult, that extends that 20, arguably 21 wide with the light chariot of combat troops, with another 6 light infantry who are perfectly decent or as good as anything else in difficult terrain as well. And it is just, try and hit the pillow, please, or hit the mattress.
Two light infantry javelin in any difficult terrain, whether it be a mountain, a steep hill, or a forest, they're going to be bloody hard. They're going to take one hell of a lot of shifting, and they're going to hold that flank down. So whilst the rest of the stuff goes down, yeah, I think it's.
I do think though in the right circumstances, this is a very tough list for the opponent to take you down because of the size and so on. However, there is a danger that, if your opponent puts, say, 2 or 3 light horse against command 3 and focuses everything else against fundamentally 16 medium swordsmen plus some light infantry, and the terrain doesn't fall very well for you.
Oh, no, you're in a world of hurt. You're absolute world of hurt.
You're in a world of hurt. So
yeah,
a lot depends, how much of a surprise, because it's an interesting debate is, when you sit down across the table from your opponent, should you declare which option you're taking? Some people like to say, no, I'm, all is that I'm using list 99, and other people say, no, you have to declare the year and the option. And if that's the case, and somebody knows you've got Scots rather than Picts, for example, that's going to give them quite a lot of useful intelligence in this particular situation.
It's very true.
No, that's an interesting thing. Maybe that's part of the psychology of why these are all folded into one, list 99, is that if you know about any of them, it just makes any of them a little bit more viable, if you're allowed to do a little bit of bluffing for a while. But again, this was attempting to make something out of that list. I think out of the list, you would, with a free choice, choose something else, but as we always do, I don't think this might not be, this isn't the best option out of this range at all. But if you are thinking of fighting a limited range of opponents, this is an option that you wouldn't be confident of having lost before you sat down with it, which is probably about as good as you can get on that one. So and I suspect on that optimistic note, that probably draws us to a bit of a close on this one. We'll have to have a think about which ones of these maybe we give a go to on Tabletop Simulator, and see if that works in another matchup. We've got a few more of those to do, and I think next time around we're probably going to dive, as I understand it, into the Crusades, and look at another match pair of the Crusaders against the Arab armies, because I think again that's a match pair that that both of them kind of miss out on a bit of love, and a bit of attention, but there's definitely something there, and so that will be in our next episode.